Viewer discretion is advised. Prologue. Bad things come in threes. 1950. Petrovka, Russia. Thing 1. Marcos ran. He ran and ran. He ran like that kind of running that makes your chest burn. He was not an athletic kid. In fact, quite the opposite. But he was not the chubby kid either. He was just average, a little too average for his liking. And to be completely honest, a little too average for any of the kids at his school's liking. He enjoyed being by himself. He liked to explore, read, and although his grades did not reflect it, Marcos was brilliant. And there we have it. Marcos was a loser. But that's kids, right? We all brand each other so we can label what makes us different. What makes us special. What makes us, us. It's so boring. So tedious. But every now and then, for some of us, something comes along to knock us off those paths and make our lives much more exciting. More challenging, more exhilarating. Poor Marcos. As he ran, images flashed across his mind. Nothing discernible. Nothing significant. Just blurs of light mixed with memories of things that had occurred that day. Kind of like the evolution of dreams one would have throughout a deep sleep. "Come back here, you little faggot," another child chasing him shouted. He had begun slowing down, but with those words of encouragement, he picked the pace right back up. He knew these woods. They did not. He spent a lot of his free time around these woods. They didn't. The trees were very thin, black and white, tall and bare, birch trees, or in Russian, bereza. They were closely knit, creating a density that was overwhelming. He knew all of them. As he ran, he knew how to dodge in and around them. And he knew if he could just make it an extra few yards, he would be safe. A concussion, an injury to the brain or spinal cord from jarring caused by a blow. When the rock hit him, it was lights out. And then this, waking up, freezing, and in pain. He began to get up, but the pain got worse. His head was throbbing. Now he remembered. He was hit in the back of the head. Slowly, he began to clean himself off. Fortunately, he got knocked out easy. Perhaps his punishment would have been different had he not. As he picked up his satchel, however, he saw that he had been sabotaged. It was torn to shreds and much lighter than before. No matter, he had to get back home. He began his walk through the woods back to the main road. The road all the kids used to get to school and back. Not much of a road, not well maintained anyway. It was, after all, just a simple mining town. Working his way up the hill to the road, he noticed something he had not before. A small shack built near the stream. This was not right. He knew these woods. He looked around, lost, but then something completely drew all his worry away and was instantly replaced with fear. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed a silhouette of some kind of creature peeking through the now cracked open door. His eyes adjusted more. Thank God. A dog. Just a dog. "Here, boy," he called out. But the animal darted inside. Marcos approached the door, completely forgetting that the entirety of even seeing this shack, let alone exploring it, puts him way off course. And who knows what time it must be. Nevertheless, he pressed on. As he came to the crack of the door, he nervously peeked in. It was pitch dark. One step at a time, he moved slowly into the shack. Then he noticed a faint light across the other side of the enclosure. "Here, boy," he tried once more. Still nothing. He made his way across the room to the faint light. A stairwell. The dog must be down here. Slowly, he continued as he began his descent. He could hear boards creaking. The walls were cement. It reminded him of the bomb shelter his dad once built. The cement was cold to the touch as a hallway began to come into focus. And as he made his last few steps to the landing at the bottom, his fingertips grazed both sides of the narrow cement stairwell. It was some kind of underground bunker, dimly lit. As his eyes slowly began to scan the floor in front of him, they were met with a strange object across the room. A structure of some kind, like a statue, a piece of art, maybe, too dim to tell. He slowly crept forward, still too dim. Wait, bars. Those are bars. Is that a cage? Suddenly the stray came back to mind. Was this where he was kept? How did he get out? No, impossible. It's all locked up. That was when he saw it. A large, darkened cage. A cage that sunk into the dark recess of the basement's corner. But why? For what? A noise came from behind him, immediately followed by a foul odor. The noise was like wet sounds, like sopping sounds, and they were getting closer. He felt a temperature change as the hairs on the back of his neck began to stand up. He slowly began to turn around. When he laid eyes on it, horror washed over his face. He swallowed, but there was no saliva to swallow. His mouth was bone dry. A puddle of urine began to surround the young boy's feet as Marcos began to shake. The dark, shadowy creature stood over him. Just then, an appendage burst out from the creature's torso. It was not exactly an arm, but seemed to behave as one. A claw with 2 fingers, one apparently being the thumb, opened. The nails on the claw went straight for the boy's jugular and stopped, as if to warn. Marcos could not move. He just stood there, frightened, cold, and shaking. The creature then began making clicking sounds with its mouth. It lowered its head to meet the boy eye to eye. But Marcos shut them, terrified of what was happening. The long nail on the end of the creature's finger then began to drip with the little boy's blood. Then, without any warning, its nail slammed straight up through the boy's skull as he was lifted to the ceiling. The creature opened its large jaws, and just like that, Marcos was gone. Prologue. Bad things come in threes. 2033. Zancudo, Ecuador. Deep in the South American jungles of Ecuador, twilight begins to settle in. A slight mist begins to roll off a nearby river known as the Agua Rico, a light, murky brown river that seems frozen to the eye. As the mist rolls across the muddy banks, it slowly begins to be swept away, and then rapidly parts as a loud rumble begins to descend on the forest terrain. Within seconds, all the trees begin to dance from the force of the ubiquitous entry. The large military cargo helicopter touches down in a clearing 150 yards north of the river, but within the dense jungle. While the propellers are still going at top speed, 3 figures in white hazmat suits jump from the vehicle and run in hunched-over positions while covering their heads. They were all holding their hazmat head coverings under their arms, and each had briefcases with them. They made their way to a concrete structure about the size of a small barn. One of the men looks around and takes in his new surroundings. He notices the high electric fences guarding the clearing from the dense outside jungle with warning signs along the fencing. As his eyes drift up, he notices cameras posted on the top of the fence facing inward. Then a look of anxiety began to wash over his face. A look that said he expected what he was seeing, but still found it unsettling because he watched the ubiquitous ascend into the air and disappear as quickly as it had arrived. They were alone. "It's too late to turn back now, Charlie." Charlie nodded his head. "We only have 3 minutes to input the codes." Sal was right. He was looking at his watch with worry and stress in his eyes. He looked back up at Jack and Renee. They needed to move quickly. The 3 of them ran inside the concrete structure. They came to a solid steel door. On both sides of the door were small black boxes bolted to the concrete walls. Renee and Sal scanned their badges on either box, then looked at Charlie. Charlie slowly approached the box on the right, reached out his hand, and opened the front cover of the box. Inside, there were buttons for numbers, just like an old payphone would have. He took a deep breath and began punching the code in. Once he was done, he closed his eyes and clenched his jaw, hoping he had not made a mistake. Just then, the steel door opened. A look of pure relief washed over all their faces. On the other side of the now open steel door, an elevator was ready for them to board. They all got in. The elevator room was extremely bright and lined with stainless steel siding. There were no buttons, no certificate of inspection like your typical elevator. Just 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor. As they all looked at one another, they simultaneously put on their hazmat head and face coverings as the outer elevator shaft steel door closed, shortly followed by the steel elevator door itself. "How far does this go down?" He looked to Sal for a response. Instead, Renee responded in her British accent. 3,218 meters, roughly. Charlie looked from Renee to Sal with a bit of confusion. Sal just smiled at Charlie. 2 miles underground, he translated. Charlie hesitated and then looked at Renee. "That's deeper than Jinping." Renee looked at Sal, rolled her eyes, and looked back at Charlie. "Jinping's underground, yes, but built into the side of the Jinping Mountains. We are going straight down." He heard the disdain in her voice, but didn't care. He had a job to do here, and he might not be Enrico Fermi, but he knew his job was just as important as theirs. "I hate confined spaces," Charlie muttered under his breath. Sal put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, Charlie. This elevator was built to sustain a blast from a bomb." For some reason, that cued both Sal and Renee to look at Charlie's briefcase for a second. Shit, if that happened, the damn thing would probably still even work. The 3 began staring at the ceiling, like polite elevator goers anywhere else would. They were closing in on ground level when another conversation transpired. "Charlie?" Charlie looked up at Sal. "Charlie, remember, do not touch anything. Keep your distance from the specimen, and for God's sake, keep your cool." Sal looked down at Charlie's side, where he was holding his briefcase once again, and so did Charlie. He then looked back at Sal, glanced at Renee, and back at Sal again. He noticed the two referencing his carry-on quite a lot, and thought he should put it to rest. You guys get your jobs done right, and I won't even have to open it. He gave Sal a slight smile. Renee and Sal gave each other a concerned look. Having a military officer in their laboratory made them both exceedingly nervous. The steel doors finally opened. Here we are, boys. They slowly exited the elevator. Charlie looked amazed. This was unbelievable. The room they were in was supposed to be a laboratory, but this looked more like an aircraft hangar. It was completely concrete. The ceiling was dome-shaped, completely curved from top to bottom. It was like being in a concrete observatory, but with no retracting doors in the roof for a telescope, and definitely no telescope. Instead, in the middle was a large cage made of steel bars. You couldn't see anything through the cage because curtains hung on all sides of it from the inside. It wasn't like other labs either. The room was dimly lit, and the ground, made of dark brown concrete, completed itself with a reflective luster. The walls were smooth, made of cinder block-like material, and stood about 15 feet high before blending into their dome existence. The room was shaped like a rectangle, spreading a good distance from the elevator doors, procuring a long, subterranean recession for the lab. Charlie noticed cameras, just like the ones now miles overhead. They were being watched. As they walked up to the cage, Sal reached out to a control panel attached to it and pressed a button. The curtains withdrew, and lights flooded the entirety of the cage. And there it was, laying on the ground. Its human-made home was a cold concrete slab, glass walls, and steel bars on the outside. The creature was extremely thin and sickly looking. Its skin was almost reptilian, rough in texture, with spikes all over it. 4 arms protruded from both sides of the creature, along with its 2 legs. At the end of each of its 8 arms and both of its 2 legs were 2 large fingered claws, with long, thick, and sharp nails, which seemed to be straight out of the Jurassic era. Lastly, a rhino-style protrusion adorned the back of its neck. There were more of them originally. Sal announced to the 2 of them. They were captured after taking out an entire Russian village during the Cold War. The Russians were convinced we had something to do with it. Both sides were experimenting with genetic engineering, so they assumed we had created something. They were able to subdue the alien clan to study it and possibly reverse engineer what we had done. They soon found out it was not us. Through the next 50 years, they tried studying the creatures. They experimented on them, dissected them, tried to communicate with them. After all these years, they have found nothing. Until now. This is the last one living that visited us all those years ago. The Russians turned to us for cooperation in this endeavor, as time was against them. We figured out a way to communicate with them through a mathematical code. They are far more advanced than us and can communicate through airwaves their own bodies create. They can download their thoughts right into our networks. In fact, if it wanted to, it could tap into any of our nuclear facility networks on the planet, hence this 6.5-foot thick concrete prison around us. And is that because of the virus? Charlie asked. Laying on the ground, half dead? Yes, it's extremely contagious. Airborne. The virus, once in the air, can travel for miles. Don't worry, it can't hurt us. It's completely incapacitated. This creature, this specimen, is the only thing on the planet that has it yet. Who knows if it got it here or came here with it? Once Dr. Shepard, Renee, and I retrieve the samples, you let us out of the cage. We exit the facility and decontaminate on the surface. Nothing will go wrong. Let us get started. Renee and Sal unlocked the steel gate and then the glass cage. They slowly walked over to the large creature with their briefcases. Each knelt on either side of it and opened their cases. Charlie closed and locked the gate and door. He watched as they spent the next minutes gathering samples from their specimen. They both stood up and headed back to the door. "All right, Charlie, let's get out of here." With that said, he began to open the locks for them. As he unlocked the glass cage, he caught something out of the corner of his eye. It was a reflection on the glass on the other end of the cage. A reflection of the creature. It was standing behind the two doctors now. Charlie's startled expression caught the attention of the two doctors, and they both turned around and were greeted with the creature right before them. Two arms simultaneously protruded from the creature's sides and impaled the two. Instantly, they both began to shake and spit up blood as their specimen proceeded to tear through their chest cavities. Charlie slammed the door and began running. He thought if he could just make it to the elevator shaft, he could get away. He was most of the way there when a cold sensation swept over his body. It was shock. He looked down to see the creature's claw peeking through his abdomen. The creature retracted its claw, and Charlie fell to the ground. He couldn't see much as he lay there on the cold concrete floor, waiting to die. He could make out blurs of light and shapes. He saw what appeared to be the creature enter the elevator, and then it was gone. The elevator doors closed. Charlie rolled to his back and sighed. He knew he was dying. While the creature slowly made its way up the elevator shaft, he reached over to his briefcase and mustered up the strength to enter the combination. He opened it, and there was a laptop. He opened the laptop, and a security box came up. And inside the security box read, "United States of America, Pentagon, Zancudo Underground Laboratory, detonation code entry." At the surface inside the concrete structure, steel doors began to open. The creature, barely able to breathe or walk, began to make its way out into the open. Suddenly, the creature was swept up in an explosion from underground that traveled through the elevator shaft and was catapulted across the clearing. It's well into the evening now. The stars shined beautifully over the Ecuadorian jungles. There was a full moon out that night, making for a bright night sky as a trail of black sooty smoke burning from the rubble below made its way to a tiny Ecuadorian village 35 miles south. (2052) Atlanta, Georgia. Thing 3. A little girl sits at her coffee table in the family living room. She seems to be extremely focused and organized at the age of 6 as she colored in her coloring book. Dad was sleeping on the rocking chair behind her, and her mom was talking on the phone in nearby the kitchen. It was a large, beautiful home, exceptionally clean and expensively furnished. Among the family portraits, some taken by photographers and some rendered by artists, hangs a large, expensive, original piece of artwork. The family portraits showed a well-to-do Asian American family of 5. Husband, wife, and 3 daughters. The artwork portrayed a family flaunting their wealth in a tacky yet somehow socially acceptable and suitable, or expected, fashion. Just the 3 of them were in this downstairs common area of their home at the moment. The young girl was, in appreciation, soaking up her current lack of sibling competition for the parental units. "Mommy, Daddy's sleeping. Can I turn my music on?" "No, sweetie. You know how Daddy likes to sleep to that stuff. Put your headphones on." Her eyes lit up at the realization of this wonderful idea her mother just had. She ran across the large living room to another overly sized living room, which seemed to be untouched, as if for show. She looked around and darted to the corner where a massive credenza sat. She opened the drawer and took out a small pair of bright yellow headphones. She put them on and raced back to her work, sitting on the coffee table, awaiting her next crucial decisions. When she got back, she waved at the TV a few times, engaging with the TV's functionality simply by hand motions. She opened a small box on the lower right corner of the screen. Within that box, she scrolled down to her desired first track and pressed play. A smile grew across her face as she plopped down and immediately went back to the work at hand. A children's song emanated softly throughout the living room from the little girl's headphones, but was drowned out by the news coming from the TV. Then, something caught the girl's attention from the screen. "Mommy, that's you," she exclaimed, gesturing at the well-dressed female senator on the screen. Her mother peeked around the corner at the TV. "Yes, Alexa, that's Mommy." She winked and blew her daughter a kiss. Alexa reached up with her hand and pretended to catch the kiss with it and giggled as she pretended to put it in her mouth and swallow it. Again, she put her headphones on and it was back to work. Suddenly, the conversation Mom was having on the phone went silent and Dad immediately sat up. There was a loud rumbling coming from over the house as the interior walls shook. Two teenage girls rushed down the stairs which led to the main foyer. Mom and Dad met the two at the bottom of the steps, within reach of the front doors of their home. "What is that?" both girls said at the same time. "I haven't the slightest idea," Dad stated, as he immediately opened the door and walked out onto their porch. There was nothing to see outside. It was dark out, but a soft light washed across the lawn, compliments of their Malibu lighting. The rumbling, however, was louder and directly above their heads. The family walked out toward the street to get a better view as they noticed the residents across from them, mirroring their strategy. Suddenly, they were engulfed in a floodlight coming from the police helicopter above. The whipping sounds of the blades made it hard for them to identify the sounds of sirens approaching the house from both ends of their upscale neighborhood street. Several cruisers with sirens blaring raced into their driveway, followed by a large government SUV with black-tinted windows. The back door opened to the SUV. A large black man in a black suit stepped out and away from the vehicle towards the family. "Senator Lee?" He pulled from his inside coat pocket a black wallet and opened it for the family to see. "I am Detective Parks. You and your family are to accompany me and this escort to Hartsfield-Jackson International. You're to be flown to an undisclosed location for you and your family's safety." She looked at her concerned husband in disbelief. Alexa, still happily listening to her headphones, not knowing the chaos her family is being swept up in, could barely hear the news. "Thank you, Senator Lee. We hope to see you back in this space relatively soon with some better news," the reporter said with audible dismay. She looked at the camera and sighed. This virus was spotted in South America nearly 2 decades ago around Ecuador, some sources have told us. It appears to have been covered up not only by the USA, but also the UN has been involved in keeping this from the public. An image appeared at the top right of the screen. It showed what appeared to be a war zone taking place in the US at the hands of rioters. Buildings were burning. Police cars were upside down and vandalized. People everywhere were running and yelling, while some seemed to be chanting and demonstrating. This backlash from the public is violent and disgusting. Many have died from this virus, but many more have died from the... A live news reporter interrupted the broadcast. Good evening, America. This is Ed Cross with CNN. The screen flashed to a collage of headshot pictures of well-dressed men and women. 7 senators were reported to have been drugged from their homes tonight in a display of retribution for the lies. We regret to report each one of those senators were murdered execution style. As disgusting, repulsive, and grotesque this demonstration is, the lies and deceit coming from Washington and from leaders around the globe causing us to lose millions of loved ones causes everyone. Here at this network, to beg the question, are these actions warranted? The following video was transmitted to our station approximately 1 hour ago. It was sent by one of the groups responsible for the murder of a sitting senator. Please understand that the following video contains unedited violence and an assault on a human life leading to death. This video is not for the young or faint of heart. Alexa, still smiling, and while coloring and listening to her music, looked up at the TV. While she listened to some of her favorite children's music, her smile vanished. A look of confusion and terror swept across her face. Her dad stepped in front of the TV and turned it off. She looked up at him with teary eyes and took off her headphones. Come with me, Alexa. Everything is going to be okay, but we need to leave. Alexa slept in between Mom and Dad. It was a private chartered jet reserved for government use. Senator Lee stood up and gave her husband a kiss on the cheek. Keep her close, John. She stepped over the two into the aisleway and walked to a small table in the back. Her 2 teenage daughters, who were sitting across the aisle from them, watched her go back there and meet 3 men at a small table. It was a small plane, so they kept the meeting to a whisper. Still, John made out some of the indiscernible conversation. Mrs. Senator, we believe it's both Russia and China cooperating. They have taken over several large military compounds and facilities. They have several nuclear warheads parked on either coast, and they are currently targeted on. The conversation became almost muted in John's head as his eyes widened and witnessed the surreal event taking place outside his window. At first, it looked like an asteroid, but then it dawned on him once it touched the earth. A bright light flooded the terrain as far as his eyes could see. Soon, a bright yellow and orange fiery light shaped into a mushroom cloud. To his horror, another happened what seemed like 100 or so miles away. He looked back to his wife, who glanced up at him. All the blood had rushed from her face, and she turned very pale. She looked back at him as a tear fell from her eye. Chapter 1. Fallout 2068. 16 years later. It has been over a decade and a half since the world went dark. Governments around the globe have tried to keep the peace as they attempt to bring civilization back to the forefront. Amidst a fraction of the population, people have split into factions in order to protect themselves from human trafficking by cartels and the Russian insurgents. Outnumbered by bad actors, the UN has temporarily suspended the Geneva Code. Enemies of the state are to be swiftly executed on sight. The US government is spread out thin across the entire Northern and Southern Americas in an attempt to eliminate all foreign threats. The Russians have completely infiltrated the continent and are seeking control of the entire population. All power grids worldwide have been crippled and remain in unstable conditions, wreaking havoc on Mother Nature. With the unfortunate but unavoidable practice of herd immunity, more than half the globe's population has been wiped from the face of the earth, leaving the virus somewhat neutralized. Humans were now left to their own devices. They were forced to keep migrating from one place to the next in order to acquire supplies. They did so while doing their best to avoid radioactive regions. They called these regions red zones. A small faction of men, women, and children have been embarking on a journey towards South America under the notion that there has been a safe harbor declared there. Our story begins here in the once flourishing and now dilapidated city of Cartels, Costa Rica. Cartels, Costa Rica, 14 miles south of San Jose. Trevor looked through his binoculars and through the double-pane glass at the building across the street. He appeared to be nearing his mid-20s, but was more like your old Southern gentleman who spoke with a little bit of a Texas twang. He was thin, well-built, and had a military-like physique. Kent, Ash, and Samel were looking through the window as well. As they took turns with the binoculars, they studied the property across the street, which appeared to be a gas station. "It looks like all the pumps are hung up," whispered Ash, a tall, thin, tan, and gangly kid who talked like your average Californian surfer. And Kent, tan, as a brown leather wallet, in his black cargo pants and ribbed white tank top, painted a portrait of a picturesque military vet dating a sexy mistress named Midlife Crisis. As if that weren't enough, he finished off his appearance with a gray handlebar mustache. "What's our next move?" Samel, a very young, tall, thin, exotic creature, spoke up in his thick, Middle Eastern accent. "Let's move on it before someone else does." "Hold on. Hold on," Trevor said in a rolling, lazy delivery while putting his hand up to the three of them, urging patience while he peered through the lenses of his binoculars. "You guys see number 4? They all confirmed they did in unison. Look just beyond that at the dumpster. The lid was down last night. Someone has been here." "Probably just someone passing through," replied Ash. "We've been watching the entire street for over an hour and not a sign of anyone." Trevor softly sighed. "You're right. It's getting dark soon. Get the generator." It was very large, so they each had to use both hands. Trevor looked at Kent, and they both nodded at each other and pulled out their pistols and checked their ammo. Trevor took the door handle that led to the street first. He reached down and grabbed a small toolbox, and he looked back at his team and slowly opened the door. Kent rushed out and hid behind a parked car on their side of the street and waved the three out. Trevor ran across the street to another parked car and hid as well. He waved the two across. Ash and Samael ran across the street, both a little sideways and sort of facing each other while staring at their target, pump number 2. Once the two cleared the car, Trevor was crouched next to. Kent ran after them. Trevor gave one final sweep of the area, stood most of the way up and ran to join his team. Ash and Samael dropped the generator next to the pump. Trevor then placed his toolbox next to the generator and opened it. There were various wires and screwdrivers within the box. Trevor grabbed a few wires and started fastening them to metal piles protruding from the side of the generator that was obviously once covered. Ash and Samael hurriedly grabbed screwdrivers and began undoing the large panel to the pump's electrical unit. As they unscrewed one screw after another, they just let the screws fall on the ground. Kent had his gun, and now Trevor's as well, and had them drawn towards opposite directions while shifting his body, creating a lethal human turret. The last screws were being undone as Trevor had just finished the wiring and waited, with anticipation of setting his eyes on his next job. They removed the panel, and the three of them got to work wiring the inside of the pump. The generator was now fully hooked up, and Trevor primed the bulb and grabbed the throttle. He looked up at the two. Ash had his hands around the handle of the pump, and Samael was ready to push 87. Ready? The two looked at each other, then back at Trevor, and nodded. Remember, the generator is on fumes, and it gets filled first, he said as he unscrewed the cap to the reservoir. They nodded once again. He then reached into his toolbox and grabbed a small broken mirror. While crouched down next to the generator, he used the mirror to catch the sunlight. He was bouncing it toward a sign that read Alto. The sign was absorbing the reflection. As he did it for a little longer, they heard engines around the corner start up. Within moments, 3 cars one by one raced around the corner. Trevor pulled the throttle. Nothing happened. They all shared worried glances. He pulled it again and still nothing. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He knew too many pulls would fill the intakes and render the generator useless. He sat there with his eyes closed and silently mouthed words to his maker and once again pulled. Finally, it started. Immediately, the gas pump lights lit and a built-in television screen came on. Ash pulled the handle from within its cradle as Samael slammed his fist on the button that read 87. The first car pulled up as they were topping the generator off. It was a beat-up old station wagon, and there was a woman driving. She seemed about Trevor's age, or a little older. The woman in the car was slim and toned. She held a presence about her that made people happy, with her flowing blonde hair, big, bright eyes, and beautiful, inviting smile. She threw Trevor an uneasy grin and turned off the engine. A much older gentleman sat in the back, sleeping. He had a rugged darkness about him and maintained a chiseled structure, all the while sporting a pair of dirty eyeglasses, currently slipping off his nose. He sat next to 2 younger, average-looking children who looked as if they were growing weary of their car seat's confines. The two were very close in age, both with blondish brown hair and blue eyes. They looked to be at most 5 years old as they rubbed their tired little faces and let out a yawn here and there. Trevor put out his hand towards Kent, who returned his firearm to him and went back to keeping a sharp lookout. Trevor tucked a gun into his belt by the middle of his back as he leaned into the car and gave a big smile to the kids in the back. Then he looked at the woman. "Hey, Beck." Beck changed her loving glance from the kids to Trevor. "Hey, Trev." She reserved a concerned look to give him as she continued to speak. "Listen, I know we got to keep moving, but the kids are starving. Can you get them something from the truck?" Trevor smiled. "Sure." Then he looked back at the older man who was sleeping. "How's Jack holding up?" Beck sighed. "He's just exhausted. He really needed a break. Trevor nodded in total agreement. "You're full. Move forward. I'll be there in a sec," he said as he gave the side of her door a couple taps. Beck started up the engine and drove around opposite to them on the other side of the pump. A large military-grade Hummer with a bed on the back pulled up after that and turned off its engine. Trevor looked at the man driving it and waved. "Hey, Seth," his best friend waved back. Seth also appeared to be the same age as Trevor. Other than the fact that he was bigger than Trevor, the pair could pass as twins. Seth, unlike his friend's clean-shaven jaw, wore a well-groomed beard and mustache. Ash began filling the rig as Trevor hefted himself up on the side step and straddled the edge of the bedliner. He opened one of the several coolers and pulled one of many brown packages out of it and jumped back down. He peeked around the truck to the car behind it. A tiny little hybrid with a man and a woman sat inside, awaiting their turn for fuel. He gave a nod and a friendly, casual-like salute to them and turned around to deliver dinner to the kids. As he began to briskly walk over to the old station wagon, he caught Beck's expression on her face as she stared wide-eyed into the distance behind him. His heart sunk, and he felt the blood drain from his extremities as he slowly turned around. "Move. Let's move now." They all turned to see a cloud of brown dust swirling into the air, coming from the ground. The origin of the dust was unknown as buildings blocked their view. This was good, because although they could not see the approaching visitors, the visitors could not see them either. It would not be long before their unwanted visitors were in sight, so the group began to scramble. Ash yanked the pump out of the rig as Samel was already uncapping the hybrid's tank. They filled it up as fast as they could and moved immediately to assist Trevor in rounding up the precious supplies. Ash looked at the two in the hybrid, which was just a small two-seater. "And Eugene, you guys holding up okay?" They were an older couple, rough around the edges, but seemingly content. Each of them was pleasantly aged around their mid-40s. They both portrayed a look that said they've had their fair share of life, but were still very capable of handling their own. Anne, who was in the passenger seat, gave a smile and a nod back to Ash. "We are good. Let's just get out of here." Then Eugene chimed in. "Next time we stop, I call the Hummer. This lunchbox wasn't exactly what I had in mind," he stated, referring to the tiny little two-seater he was operating. Ash smiled. Then immediately, him and Samel jumped into the bed of the truck and each pulled a rifle out and held onto the roll bars near the cab. They had to sit in the bed of the truck as the Hummer's cab was packed full of supplies as well. They didn't seem to mind, though. On the contrary, they seemed to really enjoy it. They were both young and in shape and enjoyed a little bit of unease. Kent climbed into the front passenger seat of the truck as he gave Ash and Samel a stern look. As Trevor slipped into the front passenger seat of the station wagon, all three cars sped off. Beck and Trevor were staring into the rearview mirrors, monitoring the situation. Trevor noticed the worried looks from the two kids. "Oh, yeah," he thought to himself, then quickly grabbed the brown package from the ground and handed it to them, which made their eyes light up. "Put on your headphones, guys," Beck thought to suggest, trying to normalize the unfolding drama. They had a little old-fashioned Discman with a headphone splitter, and each had their own headphones. Completely oblivious to the threat behind them, Caleb and Delilah gathered up their listening devices, put them on, and began opening up their dinner. Bananas, canned Spam, carrots, and a couple meat sticks was on the menu today. It was pretty much the same thing every day, with little switch-ups here or there. The pair were easily pleased. They grew up in this world, and each had their twin sibling for continuous camaraderie. At the vulnerable ages of 7, they'd already seen more in their short lives than most people 5 times their ages. "There, turn there," Trevor signaled. They were the lead car, as the other 2 vehicles closely followed. They kept looking into their rearview mirrors, unsure which direction the visitor or visitors were headed. They kept looking, but lost sight of any evidence of moving vehicles. "Take it south," Trevor quipped, speaking of the highway they were approaching. Beck made a right turn onto the on-ramp for the IA-2 south as the two vehicles followed. Ash and Samel peered past the little hybrid behind them and searched the horizon for any signs of following vehicles. Meanwhile, the sun said its final goodbyes to the west, giving a beautiful light show across the sky as its final argument before retiring for the evening. As twilight turned the last page of its chapter, Trevor felt as if he were being watched. With the intuition one would have while being stared at, Trevor's instincts kicked in, which in turn drew his attention to a dim field just off the highway. There, standing in the middle of the field, stood a tall, large, darkly clothed figure. He couldn't make out any evidence it was a person, but he knew it was staring back at him. He looked over at Beck. "You see that guy?" Beck looked over. "What guy?" Trevor pointed in the direction of the figure, gave a little chuckle and retorted, "That." But before he could get the words out, the figure was gone. "That's weird," he said in a quiet voice, almost as if he was no longer talking to anyone other than himself. They both dismissed the issue and let the sound of the highway through the poorly insulated station wagon direct the conversation for the next few moments. Chapter 1 continued. Fallout 2068. South America. As we pick up where we last left off, we come back to a familiar place, Cartagena, Costa Rica. And on a familiar abandoned stretch of highway, Trevor and Beck are engaged in conversation. "This is the starting point," Trevor stated. Beck looked down at Trevor's hand to see a gas mask, then looked back up at him. "Next 45 miles?" she questioned. Trevor answered by distributing gas masks to everyone in the vehicle as he made an announcement. "Come on, everyone. Next 45 miles. Red zone." They all put their masks on as they slowed down to traverse the once occupied military barricade with radiation warning signs set up across the highway, now dressed up in graffiti and bullet holes, compliments of the local amateur gangs. A long, dark, and desolate highway lay ahead of them. Trevor was toying with a large radio device, trying to pick up a signal. As he changed it from channel to channel, it was just static. "How far do we have left to go?" Beck asked as she looked over at Trevor. "About 3 or so hours. Once we reach Dominical, Seth's friend will meet us at the boat." Seth was the one driving the rig behind them. "You tired? Would you like me to drive for a bit?" "No," she said with a smile. "I'm the older sibling. I get to drive." They both chuckled. Just then, something began to come over the radio. Trevor swiped it off the dashboard and turned it up. "This is it," he said. "It's that recording again. Caleb, Delilah, hand me a pen," he shouted to the kids as he rifled through the glove box to pull out a notebook. He got ready to write down the information coming across the radio. The voice was slightly robotic sounding with a bit of an English accent. The reception was not perfectly clear, but discernible nonetheless. Repeating transmission. "This Izul. All networks back online. Properties are secure. Safe harbor has been acquired. Access code 719AKQ641GSY. All local grids have been restored. Rendezvous 0.54814005 and 75.5128858. Temporary access expiring 8/10/2068. The radio went back to static as Trevor went over the numbers that were already written down from prior dictations. All the numbers are right. Trevor noted to Beck. Can you imagine electricity? Running water? Beck smiled as she responded. I'm gonna take the world's longest hot shower, but how do we know this isn't some sort of trap? Trevor took a moment to think. We don't. We'll have to check it out as we get closer. He paused for a brief moment and looked back at the older man sleeping in the back. Maybe send Jack in to spy on the place. He should be able to get some good intel before, but his thought quickly ended there. Ouch, he exclaimed as Beck threw a stern older sister punch. Leave Gramps alone. Then a slight change in her facial expression as she struck a bit more serious and quiet tone. What about this Paco guy? You think we can trust him? Trevor turned around in his seat and looked at the dark silhouette following them. Seth's friend? I trust Seth. This Paco guy has a boat, and Seth seems to trust him. I'm willing to roll the dice. You got a feeling? Beck just shrugged. No, I don't think so. She turned and glanced at the kids. Then to Trevor. We just need to be careful. Dominical Beach was beautiful at night. Although vacant of venues, a boardwalk, or even crowds of people, it seemed to emanate a sense of nightlife. The Costa Rican forest met the sand with a seamless density, appearing almost out of place. The waves were calm as they washed up on the shores, as the headlights of their vehicles lit up the sandy ground. They all parked close together in a semicircle, with the headlights facing the ocean. They all stepped out of their vehicles and took in their surroundings while shaking off the long drive. There she is, Seth said as he pointed to the approaching three-level yacht, right on time. There was a long wooden dock about 20 yards in front of them that stretched out into the sea. The 10 of them began to walk towards the dock. The yacht was making its final approach, as they could hear the water being disturbed from underneath the engines, reversing their force to decrease the vessel's speed. They climbed the staircase to the docks and watched as the ship made port. Just then, they were met with halting voices from behind them. Stop there. No more walk, a man said in a thick Hispanic accent. They all put their hands up and turned around. They were met at gunpoint by 2 men. What are you doing here? A third man asked, as he appeared from behind the first 2 and walked between them, right up to Seth and Trevor. With their hands still up, Seth attempted to defuse the situation. We're meeting some friends, he stated, as he signaled with a hitchhiker-like thumb to the now docked boat behind them. The group noticed a few more men with flashlights going through their cars. Trevor rolled his eyes. In the excitement, he forgot. Always guard the supplies. And for Christ's sake, never leave your weapon. Those, my friends, that, my boat. You, not invited, the newcomer stated. Calm down, Solo. A voice beckoned from the boat. Seth breathed a sigh of relief. It was clearly his friend Polko. Evidently, Polko had more guests than he thought. The three men searching the cars looked up and joined the group on the dock. Polko emerged from the boat and briskly walked down the dock with four of his men following behind him, carrying assault rifles at their sides. "This is my family," Polko exclaimed as he put a hand on both Trevor and Seth's shoulders. The two men, once targeting the 10, now eased their guns. The 6 newcomers stood, facing Trevor's group. Their leader spoke up again. "No permission, Polko. This, my boat. I'm in charge. No room for more," he said as he turned to his men. "Go take supplies from truck." Trevor lunged forward, but the men drew their guns on him, again causing him to back up and put his hands back in the air. Salo, calm down. This was the plan. We need them, remember? Polko winked at Salo and Salo grinned. "For sale?" Polko looked at Salo. "For sale, Salo." Trevor and Beck looked at each other in utter panic and sheer disbelief. How could this be? How did Seth have it so wrong? How did he not see this? And why, for God's sake, did they leave their guns? Were they about to be caged and sold off to the highest bidder for supplies? Trevor tapped Seth with his foot and whispered, "What the fuck, Seth?" Polko walked in between the group towards Saulo, cueing the 2 armed men to again lower their weapons. Polko was shorter than the rest. He carried with him a who the hell cares and permanent vacation persona. He married that with a suitable Bahamas-style wardrobe. A little on the heavy side, this man kept a confidence about him that was mesmerizing to people engaging him. Being Hispanic, he spoke English very well, while almost seeming to emphasize his thick Latino accent. He embraced Saulo and gave him a kiss on the cheek. Then while he had his arm around Saulo's shoulders, he looked at his 4 men that escorted him off the boat. "Hombres, show Saulo the gift we have come with, for his wonderful hospitality he so kindly bestowed upon us." With that, all 4 men raised their assault rifles and began firing. Trevor's group, caught off guard, flinched and put their hands to their ears. Beck could feel blood dripping down her face as she watched the 6 men who once had guns pointed at her and her group get impaled with bullets through their heads and torsos. The now out-of-place, ragtag group looked on in horror, easily losing track of the crisscrossing flesh and blood, painting the open spaces between them all. When the firing stopped, she couldn't help her dropped jaw as she turned and looked at Trevor, who was also covered in blood and maintained a similar expression. Their eyes kept drifting to the 6, now unrecognizable figures laying before them, mangled in bloody disarray. They slowly turned and looked at Polko. He had the biggest smile spread over his face. With his arms high in the air, suggesting a celebratory hug, he walked up to the pair and embraced them and then stood back while still firmly clutching their shoulders and smiling. Then, a quick question swept across the gangster's lips. "How was your drive?"